once again, and don't worry, this is going to be the last video that I'm going to be making. So this part of our report is still the report of one of our members who is unable to do his report due to some unavoidable circumstances. So in behalf of him, I will be doing the report for him, and we'll be talking this time about electrical. I don't know how to pronounce this one correctly, but according to the dictionary, it says conduit. So we're going to be talking about electrical conduit. So what about electrical conduit? Yeah, conduit. So electrical conduits are very essential part of every house because these electrical conduits are going to be the ones that is going to be used in wrapping up your wires so that we can bury it under the concrete, because it's going to be very ugly if these electrical wires are going to be exposed in the walls of our house, right? So before we discuss into electrical conduits, let's just do a bit of a short discussion about the other electrical accessories. And these other electrical accessories include the following. So first is we have the electric meter, which I was able to discuss previously in the reading electrical plans. And although it has a different name right here, electric meter, but this is the same thing as the kilowatt meter that I have mentioned in the previous video. And this is used to measure the amount of energy or electric energy consumed by a residence. So the second one is we have the circuit breaker. So the circuit breaker is just the main switches for the different parts of your electrical wirings in the house. So as if we're going to look at the panel board, if you're going to check out the panel board that I was able to discuss earlier, so each of those panel boards is made up of circuit breakers, and those circuit breakers control a certain electric wiring in your house. So what the third one is we have the fuse. So a fuse is just a device that operates to provide overcurrent protection for an electric circuit. So I think we're all familiar with a fuse because this is also very common with our devices. And this thing actually explodes when it experiences overcurrent. So the fourth one is we have the junction box. So the junction box is just an enclosure that protects the connection of your wire. So later on, if when we reach into the discussion of electrical conduits, we will be able to see how these junction boxes are being used when it comes to connecting the joints of your wires. Now okay, so that's all for the electrical accessory. So now let's move on to electrical conduits. So we're going to be doing further discussion or in-depth discussion about electrical conduits as well as the different types of electrical conduits. But before anything else, electrical conduits refer to an electrical system used to protect or provide route of electrical wiring. So take note, it is used to protect and provide route of your electrical wiring. And these conduits are made of, it could be metal, plastic, or fiber, or it could be rigid or flexible. So later on, when we discuss the different kinds of electrical conduits, we'll be able to see these different materials of an electrical conduit. So now let's move on to the materials or the common types of electrical conduits. So the first type we have is the galvanized rigid conduit. So it is just a conduit made from galvanized steel tubing, referred to as a rigid conduit. So the thickness of a galvanized rigid conduit protects the electrical wiring from being hit and allows to be threaded. So these are mainly used in commercial and industrial applications. So if you're wondering how does a galvanized rigid conduit looks like, this is how it looks like. So it is just made up of steel, and specifically it is a galvanized iron. So as mentioned, it is mainly used in industrial purposes because we have to take note that wirings and industries or plants are exposed to hazard because it might be hit by any equipment or any sharp object anytime. That's why it has to be protected by a steel electrical conduit. But aside from that, we also have an alternative for the galvanized iron electrical conduit, which is what we call, yeah, this is another setup of how a galvanized conduit looks like. And another alternative that we can use for an electrical conduit for specifically for metals is we have the electrical metallic tubing, which is made up of steel. So in some cases, aluminum is also used, but cheaper than galvanized rigid conduit. So take note, this is a lot cheaper than the galvanized conduit. So this is also very popular in commercial and industrial buildings as well, because it is also a metallic conduit which is used to protect the wire from sharp objects or equipments anytime. But this is what makes this different is that this is normally 10 feet long. So it is a bit longer compared to the usual electrical conduits. And aside from that, what is a very good feature about this one is that it can be bent to specific radius and direction. So if you're going to look at this picture right here, these conduits have been bent into certain angles or into certain degrees, and it is very flexible. That's why you don't need connections or like elbow like those L connections to connect these wirings, because you can just twist or you can just bend these wires, or I mean these conduits easily. And if you can look at this picture right here, this man is able to bend the conduit without using heavy equipments because it is very flexible. Now, the third type of electrical conduit is a flexible metallic conduit, which is highly recommended in dry areas, and it does not maintain permanent bend. So it is quite, this is also used in industrial as well as commercial purposes because this is metallic. But take note, this is more recommendable or more recommended, sorry, recommended in dry areas. So this is how a flexible metallic conduit looks like. So compared to the previous two electrical conduits discussed, this one is more flexible compared to the EMT because if you can observe, it is made up of like spring materials, which makes it very easy to bend without exerting much of force. But what makes one of the disadvantages for this one is that it is very flexible, that it has to be, you cannot use this on exposed areas. Unlike on the two previous electrical conduits, you can use those one on exposed, you can expose those conduits. But this one, you cannot expose this one because it is very flexible and this is intended on areas wherein you have to bury this one. Now the fourth type is, yeah, this one is picture showing the connection. And if you can also observe this box right here, this is an example of a junction box, but specifically this junction box is for this kind of conduit. Now the fourth one is we have the aluminum conduit, which is commonly used still in commercial and industrial application. But what is among of its limitation includes it is not cannot be directly embedded into concrete. So as we all know that aluminum or alkalis react in cement, that's why this cannot be directly embedded into concrete. Rather, we have to put a certain layer of protection or a certain coating to prevent it when it comes in contact with concrete. Now, this type of conduit is commonly used in commercial and industrial application as well, and it is very advantageous because it does not corrode easily, and it is preferred to as it is commonly used in areas where a large amount of water and corrosion are present. So compared to the flexible metallic conduit, this aluminum conduit is highly recommended in areas wherein there are water. So this is how an aluminum conduit looks like. So it's just very similar to the previous um, two, the first two conduits that I discussed earlier. So it is still made up of metal, and it's very good as well in, yeah, you can also bend it into certain degree, and it's also, yeah, but unlike the two other metallic conduits, it requires much force in bending this one because aluminum is much hard. So now let's move on to the fifth type of conduits, which is electrical non-metallic tubing. So this time this is no longer a metal, but this one is um, it is a thin-walled corrugated tubing, and it is made up of plastic. So it can be bent easily by hand and can be easily installed due to its flexible properties. So this electrical non-metallic tubing has a same physical appearance with the flexible metallic tubing discussed earlier, but the only difference is that it is already made up of plastic. So however, fitting used to connect non-metallic tubings are rigid and cannot be bent. So this refers to the junction box. So the fittings used are not that flexible. So this is how this blue thing right here, this um, blue corrugated wires, I mean conduits right here. This is how this conduit looks like. So what we the one that is mentioned right here, which is fittings used to connect non-metallic tubings are rigid and cannot be bent. This is the one that is referred to right here. So these junction box or these fittings are actually rigid, and of course we cannot bend this one. But for the main electrical conduit, this circular thing right here, this can be easily bent by hand and it's just very flexible. But there's also another alternative for non-metallic tubing, which is what we call the PVC conduit. So PVC conduit, compared to the previous non-metallic tubing, is that it is lower in cost and it is non-conductive. That's why it requires a grounding conductor. So it is, although yes, it is cheaper, but still it poses risk because it is non-conductive and it needs a grounding conductor so that it would avoid grounding of the wires whenever the wires inside it gets exposed. So PVC conduits has a higher thermal coefficient of expansion. So this is one of the disadvantages of PVC conduits because of its high thermal coefficient of expansion. That's why it keeps when this is placed in a warm region or in a hot portion, it would expand easily, and it is not good because it would also make this expansion would also damage the material over time. So PVC conduits can vary in thickness depending on the uses where the PVC will be installed. So this conduit is the main or the common conduit that are used in different houses. And this orange thing right here, this is how it looks like. I think you are all familiar with this kind of conduit because it has been used in most houses. And this one is not intended for industrial use because, as mentioned earlier, it has a high thermal of coefficient expansion, and we have to take note that in industries or in plants, it would produce great amount of heat because of the equipments that are working in there. That's why this type of conduit is more applicable or highly recommended only for houses or small houses. So now let's move on to the next. Oh yeah, this is how the junction box of this type of conduit looks like. So this one was the one that I showed to you in the other electrical materials earlier. So this conduit it is octagonal in shape, and this junction box is if you this thing can be opened easily because if you wish to add more wirings into your house, this junction box can be easily opened so that you can install more connections in it. So now let's move on to the appearance of how do these conduits look like when it comes to installation. So as I've mentioned earlier, that